As we move forward into our open source fireside chat, we thought it was a good idea at the beginning to sort of broaden our view and look at open source projects outside of film and how they came to be, what's the benefit they're bringing to their own industry. And with that in mind, I would like to introduce the panelists that will join me now for this open source fireside chat. I'd like first to introduce Eric Bourque, who's the first two panelists there are members of our foundation, very active members. Eric Bourque at Autodesk has been leading many development and his engineers have been working on OpenColorIO and many other projects. He's here with us. And Rob Bredow is our guiding light. He was part of he led the investigation that led to the creation of the foundation. He's our chairperson for the foundation, joining us as well. Ruth Suehle is director of community outreach of the Open 3D Engine, O3DE, a new foundation that was created around that open source game engine. And Jenny Wagner is with us from LF Public Health, director of programs from LF Public Health. And David A. Wheeler is here from the Open Source Supply Security LF Security Group. Each one of them, very different angle from open source software. And I want to welcome them all with us right now as I will disable the presentation. So welcome to each one of you. It's glad to have you here today. I'd like to start by giving you a chance to go a little deeper than I did in your introduction and say a little bit more about what you do in the order I started, and then we'll come back and our colleagues from other foundations, we will ask you to describe more what you do. But first, Eric, you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and Autodesk and open source?
Yes, absolutely. So hi, yes, I'm Eric. So I'm a director of engineering within Autodesk, and I'm really focused more on our content creation products that are used for VFX and games. Autodesk has actually been participating a lot in open source for a long time. Like we actually believe very strongly in it. We have developers who work full-time on open source projects, and we were one of the founding members of the ASWF. So we've kind of been along for the ride since the beginning. And in fact, when I was kind of looking over the projects, and first of all, shout out to Material X for being the latest incubating project. But as I was looking over them, I realized we haven't contributed yet to OpenQ. So that's the only one we haven't contributed to personally. So I'm gonna try to get on that. But I think our biggest contributions have really been around OpenColorIO v2. We've done a lot of work on Material X, and there's other things where we take internal Autodesk projects and we open source those as well. In addition to things like the ASWF, the wider Autodesk is actually part of some other either open source or open standards organizations. So we're also part of the Linux Foundation's 3MF group, which is all around 3D printing. We're part of the Kronos group, where we're very interested in GLTF and some of the other standards that are there. So we're definitely kind of participating in all those open formats as much as we can. So yeah, lastly, I just want to express my thanks to David and to the rest of the ASWF for inviting me to be a panelist. I'm looking forward to learning, in particular from Jenny and David, who are going to talk about things that are really kind of outside of our industry. And I think that's going to be fascinating to hear about. Thanks.
Rob. Okay, sounds like I should jump in there, if you don't mind, David.
No, that's good. Go right ahead.
Okay, so so I'm David A. Wheeler. I am Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security at the Linux Foundation. I actually got a couple slides, so why don't I, hopefully they will help put some context in here. Let's see here. 8%. Okay. So my focus is primarily, as you can tell from my title, on security-related things. Hopefully, it's not new information to you that all software is under attack via directly where it's deployed through vulnerabilities and also through its supply chain. In other words, that whole process of developing and delivering software. And this is open source software and closed source software. Even in this industry, there's a 2014 attack on Sony Pictures. I'm sure a lot of you heard about that. Where it leaked employee personal information, copies of unreleased films, they deleted information. They also demanded withdrawal of an upcoming film, and they threatened with terrorist attacks cinemas that would screen it. And since a lot of US theater chains opted not to screen it, Sony ended up canceling the film premiere. Remarkably, in that particular case, the U.S. intelligence officials declared that that was an attack from North Korea, and in 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice actually charged North Korea. Now, North Korea denies all responsibility, but I think there's some lessons learned from here. First of all, computer system attacks are hard to attribute, and even if you have confidence in the attribution, that does not mean you get compensation. What's that really mean? That means that for those of us with computers, that's all of us, right? We're going to need to protect ourselves. We're going to have to expect that crimes are going to continue. So what can be done? Well, the Linux Foundation is working hard to improve the security of open source software. Open source software has a lot of potential to be really, really secure because it enables mass peer review. But as we all know, potentials aren't always realized. One of the things that we at the LF did is created the Open Source Security Foundation. It's a newer foundation created late 2020. And in general, we want to help develop secure software and counter supply chain attacks. I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but I know a number of you are developers, or at least oversee developers. So there are things, if you're developing software, you should be doing right now. First of all, if you didn't learn how to develop secure software, and most colleges and universities don't teach it, learn. The LF has released a free course on how to develop secure software. There's the link right there. It's actually released underneath the OpenSSF. Help projects earn a CI best practices badge. I'll come back to that in a moment. Use lots of tools in your CI pipeline. So after you make a change, it's going to run through a whole bunch of tools to check, does it do the right thing? We'll also check for security and get a lot of tools in there. Monitor for known vulnerabilities and the dependencies. Nowadays, most software is mostly dependent on other software, and that's good. That can be very helpful, but that means that if those components you depend on have a vulnerability, you need to do an update. I'm going to skip the other points because really what I want to emphasize is this notion of continuous improvement. Attacks are going to get better, so the defenders need to as well. I mentioned the CI best practices badge that identifies best practices for open source software, particularly focusing on better quality and security. Here's a couple examples, things like you must include an automated test suite, must publish the process for reporting vulnerabilities. There's 3 levels, but even getting the passing badge is an achievement. To achieve ASW adopted status requires getting a badge. And I do want to congratulate our current badge earners. OpenColor.io, OpenEXR, OpenVDB, OpenQ all have earned a badge. Congratulations. OpenTimeline.io and Open Shading Language are in progress. So, good luck. And if you need help, please contact me. Happy to help. The CI Best Practices badge is actually another project within the OpenSSF, specifically its Best Practices Working Group. Software is developed as a sequence of events, and that means that, and not just its development, but its deployment. That's its supply chain, and supply chains can be attacked. The good news, they can also be defended. So for example, a lot of attacks involve basically stealing the password of a developer. Hey, developers, please turn on 2-factor authentication. Then someone stealing your password doesn't automatically take over control of your account. Before you bring in a dependency, double check the name. The majority of attacks today in open source software is something called typo squatting, basically almost the right name. Okay, so if you just double checked, you would eliminate the majority of attacks, supply chain attacks in open source today. Keeping out of your network is just not enough. The Sony network is an example of that. And so now there's a trend towards individual device self-defense and reducing the impacts of problems. And the LF wants to help all its foundations. Another foundation is the LF Public Health. In fact, I oversaw the security evaluations of 2 LF Public Health. So why don't I transfer it over to Jenny, if you don't mind? Because she can talk more about the LF Public Health.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so my name is Jenny Wenger. I'm Director of Programs at Linux Foundation Public Health, and I actually got involved with the Linux Foundation through I think that many of us ended up with strange pandemic life stories, and mine was definitely one of them. So I had been working for a parking startup. I've got a background as a product manager, so I spend pretty much all of my time trying to figure out what people need and how do we build the technology to make a match there. When the pandemic hit and everything sort of blew up, parking was not an industry that did very well because parking mostly relies on commuters going to the office. And so I ended up finding a new path forward in building out a nonprofit open source community focused on exposure notification technology. And I'll get into what that is in a minute, but pandemic tech. And through a long series of through a long series of different things, ended up folding that into the Linux Foundation Public Health, which was just starting out, and therefore became part of the open source community in general. And it's been just a wild ride ever since to be part of pandemic technology. As I mean, not that anybody who has survived this pandemic can say that it hasn't been a wild ride. I think it's definitely been something for all of us. So just a little bit about Linux Foundation Public Health, because I doubt that everybody here is that familiar with it. So we just celebrated our 1-year anniversary. And Linux Foundation had been talking for a long while about moving into healthcare, and I think was trying to figure out exactly what that meant. The pandemic made us realize that there's this entire discipline called public health, which nobody has thought about, relies on a humongous amount of infrastructure, is critical to the well-being of every single person on this planet, and therefore seemed like a really excellent place for open source software to make a real difference. So, our constituencies that we serve, public health authorities, we've got our members, we've got the vendors who build out various pieces, the maintainers, the media. So we're doing education on the technology we're building. We're working with all the people building the technology. We're working with the public health authorities to make sure that the right technology is being built. All of those different things together. Our two main products that we're supporting right now, one is exposure notification, and the other is COVID certificates. And then we're planning to expand out. We're really looking forward to when we don't have to talk about COVID every day. That day is not here, but one day it will be, and we'll be able to add more to our portfolio at that point. Exposure notification is that Bluetooth technology, and I just want to give this background because I think that some of the questions later having this might help. But it's where you can activate it on your phone in most states and countries in the world at this point, though not everyone. And it essentially uses Bluetooth to tell whether you've been close to somebody else's phone. If that person later goes to test positive, they can then upload that data and it anonymously sends an alert to your phone saying that you've been notified and why, and what your next steps should be. I think that it's been a great space to be in because it's an area where this technology didn't used to exist. It's something where public health authorities really wanted the advice and they wanted, help on understanding this technology and what to do about it. So as a foundation, we've been really able to develop relationships with the public health authorities and help walk them through the technology. It happens to be a space where it's one of those sort of perfect open source stories, I think, where the government of Ireland actually worked with a company called Nearform to develop the exposure notification app for Ireland. And Nearform said, yes, we'll do it, but only if you promise to open source this technology so that other countries and jurisdictions can use it. Ireland agreed, and so they built everything out and then open sourced it. And so now it's in use in New York and New Jersey and Delaware and the actual country of Jersey and Northern Ireland and all over these different places. So you now have a network of public health authorities using the technology. Nearform actually ended up building out the implementations for most of these countries. So they actually managed to get more business from this and grow their company based on open source software. And so it's exactly how we want that open source ecosystem to work and then now, this is something that public health authorities aren't used to seeing. They're all getting the downstream updates. Usually with with the technology that these jurisdictions are applying, that are using, they just get the they get the they install the tech, and then they're like, okay, I guess that's that. And if something changes, they have to pay to get it changed and deal with all these different things, and it often breaks their systems. And in this case, it's just working. So we're actually seeing a lot more adoption of an openness to open source technology because of the success of exposure notification. Our other area is COVID certificates, which has been a really interesting space. This is allowing you to share your vaccination status with somebody, whether it be an employer or a restaurant or a border security as you're traveling across country. I think we all are imagining situations where we're going to have to be sharing our vaccination status moving forward. My favorite thing here, or the thing that I think is really, really cool with ASWF is that one of our projects, MedCreds, was actually used in a pilot last August by a cast and crew of 25 people in LA. So they got a physician to order PCR tests for everybody who was participating in this filming. Pardon, I'm just getting over a cold. I hope you'll forgive me. The physician then used MedCreds to deliver the test results not only to all of the participants, but then delivering it to the COVID coordinator for the filming. And so, this was, I think, a really early application of this technology. It was all done securely without revealing unnecessary PII, based on some really cool underlying tech. And so we're really looking forward to building out this technology, because we think that it's not only going to be useful for vaccinations, but that, we're actually going to start to see it, for health security more broadly, making sure that people are safe to be out and about, not spreading colds like this one where I'm, staying home. And eventually it might be also that you start carrying your allergies on there, so that if you end up in the ER, somebody can figure out what you're allergic to, even though they don't have access to your health record. Things like that are going to be really useful. So, we're really proud of being able to have done these things so far. I'll keep it, I'm trying to keep it short. So I'll stop there. Thank you all so much. I'm really glad to be here.
No problem. We'll give you a break for your voice. We'll come back with lots of questions. What you're doing is really, really intriguing and important. And we can go to you, Ruth, now. Can you tell us more about the O3DE project, please?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ruth Suehle. I wear a number of hats in the open source world, so my roles in life understandably got a bit blended on the intro slide. I'm the director of the community outreach team in Red Hat's open source program office. I'm also executive vice president of the Apache Software Foundation. I'm interested in open source communities in a lot of areas in a lot of ways, and my job at Red Hat is about making sure those communities are healthy and successful. But more recently and relevant here, I have co-chaired the International Game Developers Association's open source SIG for several years, and I'm joining this panel on behalf of O3DE and the O3D Foundation, as you mentioned. So for folks in the call, if you missed that launch last month, it's cool. There's a lot going on in the world. So it all actually just launched almost exactly a month ago right now. The Open3D Foundation, under the Linux Foundation, will support open source projects around 3D graphics and rendering and such. And the first project is O3DE, or Open3D Engine, which grew out of Amazon's Lumberyard game engine. But I do like to note, game engines are not just about gaming. They're about video creation and automotive applications and healthcare and scientific simulations, applications well beyond just playing games. A lot of people hear game engine and get stuck on the idea of a video game. But so let me tell you for a minute about O3DE and how cool it is for all of those things. It is a multi-platform 3D development engine, as the name implies, for building cinema quality worlds, for building AAA quality games, for video production, high fidelity simulations, whatever you might want to use that type of engine for. And it's got some pretty awesome features, especially for folks who hear Lumberyard and think, oh, it's just Lumberyard. It's not. It's well beyond Lumberyard now. One particularly nice feature is Atom, the cross-platform renderer, which is a new real-time renderer that supports physically based rendering and ray tracing. You get to say you can split an atom because it's modular. Sorry for that. No, I'm not entirely sorry for the pun. I like puns, but it does let you customize. It's scriptable. Game developers want more creative control, and that's really what O3DE can offer, more choice, particularly with that modularity. And having a fully open source engine means that not only do they have that choice and control in the engine and how they use it, but they can actually join the community and play a part in its development and future. And that's the heart of open source, which I'm sure folks here understand very well. It's why that development model works so well wherever we apply it. We in that broad global sense of the term. But the game industry is an industry that isn't historically deeply involved in open source, or perhaps in some cases even entirely friendly to it. ASWF is familiar with a similar scenario, and I'm excited to see how O3DE and the foundation can make some of the same progress in the game industry, and those related ones I was talking about, the Academy Foundation has been able to for the film industry. I'm excited to see the O3D Foundation and the Academy Foundation work together. It's been great to see such a rich set of open source libraries and tools develop and grow. The ASWF really takes things to another level with better organization and collaboration. And sharing media and tools across those two industries is happening more and more. So, for example, a lot of us found joy last year in The Mandalorian, and we're seeing how they used Unreal Engine to create the sets. And doing those sorts of collaborations with open source and open standards will make those collaborations easier all around. I've been involved in open source for a long time now and seen these benefits of open source software and working openly in general for a long time. I've been at Red Hat specifically for 14 years. That alone is a pretty significant stretch of open source history with a lot of change. We're at a place now where a lot of long timers in open source feel like they can say open source won. And in a lot of ways it has. It has won so many things and come to a place that felt, I don't want to say impossible, because certainly we're here, but for sure difficult to imagine at times in the not so distant past, right? So we've seen so much success over the last decade or two, really just at an increasing rate. And we've seen increasing adoption of open source in amazing ways and places I never thought I'd see it really, but open source also still has a lot of corners left to find and work itself into, and the game industry is the next one of those, and I'm really excited to be a part of that. One of the things I've been delighted to do during the pandemic is extend a program we have at Red Hat called CoLab, which is where we were previously going in person to middle school age girls around the world and teaching them about collaboration and open source principles through electronics. And so we've been taking that to a virtual delivery, which has some challenges. I can't really help you with a soldering iron over the internet quite as well. So one of the ways that we did that was a game development-based class. We built a short text adventure game for them, and they get to write some of the descriptions in the game, so each class has their own version. But as a part of it, I get to show these kids how much open source is being used in things they love and don't even realize, probably didn't even know what open source was before they got there. And we talk about all the great open source tools that they could go get the second class ends and start building games together, starting with the basic Inkscape and GIMP sort of things, Audacity. But then I show them that Blender was used for the moonscapes and the Mass Effect teasers and the animated logos for Guardians of the Galaxy and Wonder Woman, and now they're impressed, right? Because that's the stuff they know and love. And so now when I do those sorts of engagements, I can show them O3DE too and the power of that. And that's exciting to me, not just for game development and not just for the future of technology, but for whatever those kids end up doing one day. And reaching kids through gaming is such an easy and natural fit. I have two of my own whose hands might be like permanently controller shaped. But if we can show these kids where all of that comes from and how exciting it is, we have the next generation of technologists and the next generation of creators. Because even if the technology isn't what they're passionate about, that's okay. Because what we're really teaching them isn't game development or circuit building or whatever the class might be about. We teach them about the principles that drive open source development. And when I say we, not just me teaching these collabs, but us as a whole, the adults bringing up this next generation. We can teach them that even if you're in 6th grade and your teacher says not to look at your friend's paper, that actually working together, truly collaborating is powerful and how it's done such great things. And we can show them the variety of ways that collaboration makes software better, not just in the code, but in all the other things that go into it, the art and the writing and the translations. And then when they turn into that next generation of technologists, that means we have more people ready to take open source into everything, into all those places. It hasn't completely won over yet. So I know I digressed a bit there, but O3DE for me is a piece of all that. It's the next step in this always exciting road that open source is taking. But to come back around, if O3DE and game development is of interest to folks here, which I hope it is, I wanted to put in 2 plugs while I have a chance. The first is for O3DECon, which is co-located with KubeCon in Los Angeles in October. And I'll drop the link in chat. It also has a virtual option. The CFP for that is actually still open through the end of this week, and I would love to see your submissions there. And my other quick plug, oh, chat's not working for me. There we go. Is for the O3DE Jam, which will be a game jam launching at the end of this month. And it'll be a month-long jam, which is a little long, it seems like, but it's to give you plenty of time to get familiar with a new tool and create something super cool. Pre-existing assets are fine, totally allowed, as long as you create the entry with O3DE. And that's my 2 plugs. I think that wraps me up. I'll drop the link for O3DE in the chat as well. That's
amazing. Thank you, Ruth, for all that you told us here. Sorry that we didn't introduce you properly. You have lots of things you're doing, so we'll do better next time. Cool. And I'd like to pass the microphone to Rob. Maybe Rob, you mentioned the Mandalorian, Ruth. So Rob was very involved with the development of that show and is our chairman. Rob, you want to do your own introduction, and perhaps you get the first question.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to have such a interesting panel, especially, we get very focused on the tools that are specifically developed for our area, which are very important. And we're going to spend a lot of time focusing on them, but I'm glad we're starting this in a more general way. And I think there's a lot to learn on the security side, on the game engine side, even from public health, which may not have as clear direct connections, but they're in their formative years as a new group in the Academy Software, in the Linux Foundation. So I think we have a lot to learn from these panelists. So both Eric and David and I wanted to spend the majority of the time asking questions of our guests. Just real quick intro for me, if I don't know you, I'm Rob Bredow. I'm the Chief Creative Officer at Industrial Light and Magic. I've been involved in open source for I'd say almost 20 years now in a significant way. I was at Sony Pictures ImageWorks before now, where we open sourced a lot of projects, following in the footsteps of OpenEXR and what ILM had done before. And then I joined ILM, and we've got a few open source projects here as well. We're very committed philosophically to this as the best way forward for certain kinds of technology, certain kinds of innovations, especially for open standards and the like. But the other opportunities exist as well, which you're going to hear about from our working group meetings today, if you're not already up to speed. So there's lots of exciting things going on in our Academy Software Foundation, in our industry, in the open source area. There's even Academy Awards that have been won by people who are engineers on these projects. So if you didn't know you could win an Academy Award, a Scientific and Technical Achievement Award, to be specific. Now from the Academy, you can actually win that kind of award by writing software that gets used in movie making. So very exciting opportunities. If you're new to this, there's a whole world to explore, and it's open to everyone. So we would love to use the Q&A built into Zoom, or if you want to ask a question live, you can raise your hand, and I think Rachel is standing by. She can upgrade you so you could pop up, but you don't have to do it that way. You can use the Q&A where you don't have to appear on video. One question was already asked and answered, but why don't we just answer it again live, because it's so interesting and maybe not everybody has jumped in. CII and the best practices sound like they might be a big process and it might not be achievable for a smaller project, but it sounds like it's designed to work for projects of all sizes. David, do you want to talk about that a little?
I'd love to. Yeah. By the way, I lead the CI Best Practices badge, so happy to talk to you about that. Absolutely, it's completely doable for small projects. I mentioned there are 3 badge levels: passing, silver, gold. But even passing by itself is actually a significant achievement. The topmost level, gold, it really requires multiple developers. It doesn't have to be a big project, but it does have to have multiple developers. But the passing and silver levels are completely doable by a single person. We have a number of relatively small projects by people just doing it, off hours, single person, and still completely able to get a badge. And they're really focused on what are the steps you can take to reduce the risks to your users? And there's a whole lot you can do without requiring investments of millions.
That's great. And you use Sony as the example, which is an example that strikes close to home for me, which is they are the reason that I have to watch my back very carefully for the rest of my life and my family's, because all of my information was out there, along with everybody else who ever worked at Sony during that time. So it was interesting when the CII badge went on as a requirement for our projects to graduate, again, not to be incubated, but to graduate into fully adopted status. There was some debate about whether it was worth that kind of investment. And was it going to be a bureaucratic process? And there is some process to it, absolutely. But I think a number of us who have endured various hardships as a result of various security practices, and this isn't going to, this doesn't eliminate all the risk, but as you say, it can help reduce the risk, which is fantastic.
Eric, you want to take the next question?
Yeah. So maybe just to follow up on what Rob was saying, where I think it's, we have this tremendous opportunity that we have people here that are not usually talking to us in our kind of smaller community. So I have a question for Jenny, and I'm going to try to frame it. When I talk to people about what I do, their eyes glaze over, right? If you talk about 3D modeling, if you talk about rendering, you talk about any of that, they don't want to know the details. I can imagine that in your case, it's highly technical, but it's highly applicable to many people, right? It basically affects everybody. So I can imagine that in your particular area, communication of what you're doing is probably extremely important. And I'm wondering if you face any challenges or if you have advice or things like that.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody saw in the news, there was, we've actually been spending a lot of our time on the media side of this, right? If you saw all of the debate about vaccine passports, it's the, I've spent a lot of time on the internet, but haven't been necessarily in prominent positions. And this was the first time that I got some like real serious hate mail about how I was destroying the earth and, bringing back all sorts of evil people from our history and comparing me to them. And we've been working a lot on, just basic things like branding, right? Not calling them vaccine passports, because they're not about vaccines only, they're not about passports. So we have had to do this public messaging and really figuring out how to join in that conversation. With exposure notification, one of the things that was really interesting actually is that when we all started, we thought the technology was going to be the hard part. We pulled together, via open source in 6 weeks, there were working prototypes on how to do this Bluetooth communication without actually revealing anybody's identity or their COVID status to anybody else, and all of these technical things that we were worried about in cryptography. And we're like, okay, we got that done. Now we just got to deploy the tech. And turns out that was where the actual challenge started, right? So, but public health authorities had never had this experience of getting people to download an app versus the tech industry had. So it was this interesting marriage in the communication side there too, figuring out what do people really care about? How do we position this? We ended up going with a really strong privacy first angle, because turns out that's where the public's mentality was at. Or at least that's where, there were going to be the people who were going to download it no matter what, because that was their nature. And then there were going to be the people who were sort of on the fence. There were people who were going to say, never, ever will I download something like this onto my phone. So we discarded the never evers. We trusted that the people who were going to be cool with it were going to go on it. And we focused what's the messaging of that middle group? And it turns out that their privacy was one of the biggest things. So we focused in on that. We're seeing that again with the vaccination credentials. With the COVID credentials, privacy, security are really big things. Because, so Sony Pictures, yes, it was, as Rob demonstrated, it was a personal story, right? It wasn't just a corporate story. And I think that people are very nervous about data breaches. And so, making sure that we're building technology that has as much data decentralized as possible so that breaches don't actually harm people is another piece of that security, and how we're looking at this, how we're messaging it, all of that.
I have a quick follow-up question for you, Jenny. When in the LF public health role, do you get into the policies around the technology and the recommendations for that? So I can just, a story, I'm working in the UK right now. They have quite a sophisticated track and trace program, maybe imperfect, but sophisticated. But it's really interesting that the dynamic now, because a lot of people were getting what they call pinged, which is everybody, there was a lot of notifications going out that you may have been exposed because of the thresholds that were set in the system. And then the policy here was a 10-day quarantine if you got pinged, no matter how many negative tests you got. So a lot of people were like, you know what, I don't want to be scanning anywhere because I don't want to get pinged and be told to quarantine, which of course defeats the whole purpose of the system. How much, in addition to supporting all the technology and trying to roll that out, how much advice are you in the role of giving a lot of advice to these public programs, or is it kind of, it's many steps removed, I'm sure, from the day to day?
Yeah, so I do not have an MPH or any sort of advanced degree that would help me provide that kind of advice to public health authorities, right? But in the spirit of, what we've decided to do actually is use that spirit of open source to get the public health authorities the ability to get that data and make those decisions with more knowledge. So a great example is with an exposure notification. What you're talking about there, that how many pings you send out is what we call risk scoring. It's, when your phone decides that it has either crossed that threshold of risk or not. And so we actually convened a symposium last November where we created an open source document saying, based on what we know, based on this and that and the other, here are the settings that we would recommend, and here's what we would lead to with that. Given all that we know now compared to November, we've got so much more data about the technical side of these systems, how they work. The Delta variant definitely changes the equation on how sensitive you want these apps to be. We're actually reconvening this group next week, again, to have this conversation and create an open public document that anybody can comment on and contribute to, ask questions about, and connect with other specialists. So we're using a whole bunch of different techniques to introduce the concept of open source to this community, and we're not limiting it just to the technology.
Great. We got a specific question related to the Academy Software Foundation in the Q&A from Stephen, asking about, is there any one project or non-project specific place that the Academy Software Foundation expresses its highest development priorities or needs? Or do you just go to GitHub for these projects? You certainly can go to GitHub. You certainly can look at pull requests. There's lots of places to get stuck in on each of the projects. On the mailing lists tend to be, or the Slack channels tend to be a really great place to go if you're interested in a particular project. If you're more interested in general and kind of getting a lay of the land and getting where the biggest needs are across the entire array of projects, I recommend joining one of the TAC meetings, which is the Technology Advisory Council. And from a perspective of what all of the engineering happening inside the Academy Software Foundation, this is really the hub. This is where all the projects get together. They talk about where their needs are. They talk about overlap. They talk about not duplicating libraries and things like that, and how to get everything working in one build environment. All of that is handled in the TAC, in addition to a lot of the strategic choices of the next kind of technology areas that we're going to be developing, launching of working groups, all sorts of things like that happen in the TAC. So if you're interested in the real heartbeat of the technical discussions that are happening inside of the Academy Software Foundation, I suggest joining a TAC meeting. They're open to everyone. There's votes and things that are specifically for the people that are members of the TAC, but those are open for anyone to attend. And they're documented. You can catch up on notes. Lots of ways to participate if you have those kind of interests. And Misha
Time
just
flies. Time flies when we're having fun. We have 5 minutes left. I'm going to pull up a poll for people. I want to encourage questions from the audience. So audience, please, if you have questions, get them on the poll, and we will rank them, or you rank them, and we will answer probably the top one in the time we have left. And then I want to get it back to you, Eric and Rob, for continuing on the questions with our panelists in the meantime.
Yeah, why don't we, I would love to ask Ruth, what are some of the immediate needs? I've heard, by the way, some of the exciting things that have already happened in a short amount of time, because you guys have only been public for about a month, I think, with this project, at least at any sort of scale. And I heard that some of the community contributions have already been pretty substantial in that time period. So congratulations on their early success. And what are some of the needs and some of the things you guys are seeing as Open3D Engine gets off the ground here in this format?
Yeah, so this may be a personal bias. No, it's entirely a personal bias. For me, it's getting O3DE fully functional on Linux, and it's coming and it's close. We were hoping for day one, but we are getting there, and that is huge to me, and exciting in so many ways. You know, not just to have this open source engine working on Linux in general, but to have something of that significance. You know, close to day one working on Linux, not as an afterthought, but as a fundamental part of the plan. So for those who are fully committed to the whole open source workflow, I promise it's on the way.
That's great. we have a small proof case of a really high-end rendering working on Linux at ILM. Our stagecraft technology, we run Unreal as you highlighted, and we run Unreal Engine. We can run that on the walls, but we also run a version of the renderer called Helios that is all running on Linux. It does a lot of really high-end rendering too for some of our biggest walls. So it's very exciting. Sometimes there's the right operating system for certain jobs, and it's really great to have Linux as an option for that kind of work. So that's very exciting.
Cool. I actually have a follow-up for Ruth, which is unrelated to O3DE. There's something you said during your intro that I thought was super interesting. You said open source won. And I started thinking about it. I was like, the rules of the game are changing. The devices are changing. The technology is changing. The way we interact with all those things is changing. When you think into the future, 10 years forward, 20 years forward, do you think that there are other kind of impending things that are happening that are going to change the way that we look at open source?
For me, it's about, and I know a lot of people are reluctant to use the term open source to apply to anything beyond software, but for me, that's what it is. It's about these principles that are so successful for software development being applied in a lot of other ways. So about a dozen years ago or so, I helped launch opensource.com. It's a Red Hat project. And now if you go there, you'll see lots of software and technology things. But at the time, we literally talked about no software at all. It was about the movements of open source principles in government, in business applications, in legal communities, in everything. And so actually, when I look back at where we are today with O3DE and the Steam Deck launching and all of that, and I think about when I posted probably about 10 or 11 years ago, Steam for Linux confirmed as an April Fool's Day joke. Like it just, where we are today sounded completely bananas at the time. But that is what the next frontier of open source is for me. It's about applying all of this success of collaboration and transparency and all of that is so successful for open source and software to all of these other ways, open education resources, open healthcare systems, transparency in government, all of that.
That makes total sense.
We have a few questions that popped up so the one there on top is, can we access the open source vaccination app? Is this something that we can access right now, or is it subject to regulations and local enforcement?
So the So LFPH's vaccination credential apps are both obviously they're open source. If you wanted to download them and run them locally on your phone, you can. We've got Aruba running one in production right now, and we've got a few sort of quiet conversations going otherwise. So if you're traveling to Aruba, you would have a reason to download it. Beyond that, I'm not certain that it's so useful right now, but they're, the Excelsior Pass in New York State is in use at this point. We can go into some of the what California has chosen to do. That's a much longer conversation that I'll save for our, if you want to, we can do happy hour at some point in time.
Right.
But yeah, we would love contributors, right? And we would love people participating in it. And learning more about it.
I'm sure many of us would like to help, so we'll keep an eye on your project. And unfortunately, we're coming at the end of our time already, so we could have gone for another hour, I'm sure. So I want to encourage all of our viewers to go and follow the projects, the 3 projects that we got a glimpse of right now. There's a lot more in each one of them. I think our goal was to start our conference by opening our minds to all the ecosystems out there that exists and that we can help, and they can help us at the Academy Software Foundation in all kinds of ways. I hope it was helpful to you. I want to thank you, panelists, for joining us at the beginning and in kickstarting our conference. It was really great. Thank you very much. And stay tuned, audience. In 15 minutes, there's a break, and then it's Open Color.io that kicks the real part of the conference with all the great updates about the projects and all of it. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everybody who's at the foundation who put the conference together. Thank you.